You know what they say about first impressions? Well, Marcus Kane was about to make one that would haunt a certain reptilian diplomat for the rest of his natural life. Not that Marcus knew this, of course. He was just a guy with a toolbox, a transfer order, and a cat carrier stepping onto Harmony 7, the galaxy's most politically correct attempt at interspecies cooperation. Picture this, a space station the size of Manhattan spinning lazily in the void, housing representatives from 47 different worlds. The Galactic Council's crowning achievement in diplomatic architecture, where beings who'd been shooting at each other for centuries now had to share coffee breaks and filing cabinets. What could possibly go wrong? Marcus whistled as he walked through the pristine corridors, his work boots squeaking against the polished floors. The cat carrier bounced gently at his side, and if you listened carefully you could hear a soft purring emanating from within. Standard stuff, really. Human gets transferred to deep space assignment, human brings pet. Tale as old as time, or at least as old as the Terran Colonial Expansion Act of 2387. Excuse me, are you the new human engineer? Captain Nora Blackwood appeared around the corner, her uniform crisp enough to cut glass. She had that look of someone who'd seen every possible disaster scenario and had contingency plans for disasters that hadn't even been invented yet. That'd be me, Marcus replied, shifting the carrier to his other hand. Marcus Kane reporting for duty. And this is Mr. Whiskers. The captain's expression softened slightly. The paperwork mentioned a companion animal. I trust it won't be a problem? Oh, he's no trouble at all. Perfect gentleman, aren't you, buddy? Marcus tapped the carrier, earning another purr in response. What neither of them noticed was the tall, scaled figure observing from the observation deck above. Vex Thornscale, diplomatic attaché from the Zephyrian hegemony, watched the exchange with the kind of expression usually reserved for stepping in something unpleasant. His amber eyes tracked the human's movements, and when they landed on the cat carrier, his lip curled in disgust. Zephyrians, you see, had very particular opinions about what constituted civilized behavior. They'd evolved from apex predators on a desert world where weakness meant death, and they'd carried that philosophy into their spacefaring civilization. The strong ruled, the weak served, and emotional attachments were seen as evolutionary dead ends. The sight of a supposedly sentient being caring for what appeared to be a small, furry parasite was, in Vex's mind, the perfect example of why humans didn't belong in civilized galactic society. Pathetic, he muttered, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. Absolutely pathetic. The orientation proceeded smoothly enough. Marcus was shown to his quarters, received his assignment schedules, and was introduced to his new workspace in Engineering Base 7. Mr. Whiskers, meanwhile, had been released from his carrier and was conducting his own inspection of their new home. He moved with the fluid grace that only cats possess, his green eyes taking in every detail with an intensity that seemed almost calculating. Settling in well? Captain Blackwood asked, making her final rounds. Like we've been here for years, Marcus replied, scratching behind Mr. Whiskers' ears. The cat leaned into the touch, purring contentedly. He's got good instincts about places. If he likes it, I like it. The captain nodded approvingly. The mess hall serves meals around the clock to accommodate different species schedules. You'll find the other staff quite welcoming. She wasn't wrong about that. The crew of Harmony 7 prided themselves on their inclusivity. There was Jana, a cheerful Altarian whose tentacles could perform 17 different tasks simultaneously. Chief Petty Officer Grunt, whose actual name was unpronounceable but whose engineering skills were legendary. Dr. Kira Voss, a Centauri healer whose bedside manner had been described as aggressively therapeutic. But there was also Vex Thornscale, and Vex had opinions. If there's one thing diplomats excel at, it's making their displeasure known without technically violating any regulations. Vex Thornscale had turned this into an art form, and Marcus Kane was about to become his latest masterpiece. It started small, as these things usually do. a snide comment in the elevator about primitive bonding rituals, a theatrical sigh whenever Mr. Whiskers appeared in the corridors. You know, the kind of passive-aggressive behavior that makes you want to stuff someone in an airlock, but you can't because they're technically being polite. "I simply don't understand," Vex announced to the mess hall during the second week of Marcus's assignment, his voice carrying that special tone reserved for explaining obvious things to obvious idiots. "How can a species that claims to have mastered faster-than-light travel still cling to such evolutionary baggage?" Marcus, who had been quietly eating his lunch while Mr. Whiskers napped in a sunbeam by the viewport, looked up with raised eyebrows. "Evolutionary baggage?" "Your pet," Vex said, making the word sound like a curse. "Surely you must realize that emotional dependency on lower life forms is a sign of psychological inadequacy." The mess hall had gone quiet, the way it always does when someone's about to either apologize or start a fight. Marcus took a slow bite of his sandwich, considering his response. Mr. Whiskers, meanwhile, had opened one green eye and was watching the exchange with interest. "Ha," Marcus said finally. "That's an interesting perspective. Tell me, Vex, what do you do for companionship on those long diplomatic missions?" Vex's scales flushed a deeper shade of green. "I have intellectual pursuits, scientific research, cultural analysis. I don't need to project parental instincts onto a creature that exists solely to consume resources." "Right," Marcus nodded sagely. "Because nothing says evolutionary advancement like being completely alone in the universe." The conversation might have ended there, but Vex was just getting started. Over the following days, he launched what could only be described as a campaign of educational harassment. He prepared presentations for the crew about the psychological implications of interspecies codependency. He left scientific papers in Marcus's workspace about parasitic relationships in primitive cultures. He even went so far as to create a detailed cost-benefit analysis of pet ownership, complete with charts and graphs proving that Mr. Whiskers was a net drain on station resources. "Did you know," Vex announced during one particularly memorable breakfast, "that your companion animal consumes approximately 0.3 kilograms of processed protein per day? That's enough to feed a Zephyrian juvenile for 3 days. Marcus, who had been teaching Mr. Whiskers to high-five, paused mid-motion. "Did you know that your diplomatic immunity doesn't extend to being an insufferable jackass?" "I'm simply trying to help you understand the broader implications of your choices," Vex replied smoothly. "As civilized beings, we have a responsibility to move beyond primitive instincts." What made it worse was that some of the other crew members were starting to find Vex's presentations genuinely interesting. The Altarians, with their hive mind mentality, couldn't comprehend individual attachments. The Centauri, who reproduced through spore cloud fertilization, found the concept of pet ownership baffling. Even some of the more pragmatic species began questioning whether resources might be better allocated elsewhere. Marcus bore it all with remarkable patience, responding to each attack with dry humor and unflappable calm. But those who knew him well might have noticed the slight tightening around his eyes, the way his hand would unconsciously move to stroke Mr. Whiskers' fur when Vex launched into another lecture. Mr. Whiskers, for his part, seemed to be paying very close attention to these exchanges. He'd taken to following Vex around the station, always staying just within the reptilian's peripheral vision. When Vex would turn to look directly at him, the cat would be doing something perfectly ordinary, sitting in a sunbeam, cleaning his paws, or playing with a piece of string. But there was something about the way he watched Vex that made the diplomat increasingly uncomfortable. "There's something wrong with that animal," Vex complained to Captain Blackwood during one of their weekly diplomatic briefings. "It's always staring at me." "Cats stare at things," the captain replied diplomatically. "It's what they do." "Not like this," Vex insisted. "It's like it's studying me, planning something." Captain Blackwood had dealt with enough interspecies misunderstandings to recognize the signs of escalating paranoia. "Perhaps you should consider adjusting your interaction patterns with Engineer Kane." Diplomatic friction can sometimes manifest in unexpected ways. But Vex wasn't listening. He was too busy formulating his next move in what he'd come to think of as his campaign to civilize the human. After all, someone had to save Marcus from his own primitive instincts. He had no idea that someone else was making plans too. There's a moment in every conflict when someone crosses a line they can't uncross. For Vex Thornscale, that moment came during the monthly diplomatic reception, when his campaign against Marcus's primitive pet escalated from annoying to genuinely threatening. The reception was Harmony 7's attempt at fostering interspecies goodwill through the universal language of cocktails and small talk. Representatives from dozens of worlds mingled in the station's main conference hall, discussing trade agreements and cultural exchanges over drinks that could probably strip paint. Marcus had been cornered by a group of Altarian engineers who were fascinated by his work on the station's gravity generators, while Mr. Whiskers had claimed a prime spot on a nearby windowsill, watching the proceedings with typical feline detachment. That's when Vex made his move. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, his voice cutting through the conversational buzz like a rusty blade, "I believe it's time we address the elephant in the room. Or should I say, the cat." The crowd turned, drinks paused halfway to various forms of mouths, appendages, and breathing apparatus. Marcus felt a familiar knot forming in his stomach, and for weeks now. Vex continued, clearly enjoying the attention. "We've all been forced to accommodate this human's emotional dependency on a primitive life form. But I ask you, what kind of message does this send about our commitment to civilized discourse? Are we truly meant to share our advanced facilities with creatures that contribute nothing to our collective progress?" Marcus started to step forward, but Captain Blackwood appeared at his elbow, her hand on his arm. "Let him finish," she murmured. "Give him enough rope." Furthermore, Vex was warming to his theme now, his scales shifting to a more vibrant green. This animal represents a potential contamination risk. Who knows what diseases it might carry? What primitive behaviors it might inspire in other species? I propose that for the good of this station, we implement immediate regulations regarding the presence of non-sentient organisms in our shared spaces. The crowd murmured uncertainly. Some species nodded in apparent agreement, while others looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. "In fact," Vex said, his amber eyes gleaming with triumph, "I believe we should remove this creature immediately. As a gesture of good faith, I'll personally ensure its relocation to more appropriate accommodations." He started walking toward Mr. Whiskers, who was still perched on the windowsill, apparently oblivious to the commotion. But as Vex approached, the cat turned to look at him directly, and for just a moment, something passed between them. Not the usual bored indifference of a house cat, but something sharper, more focused, more aware. "Come here, you little parasite," Vex muttered, reaching out with one clawed hand. "Time to learn your place in the natural order." That's when Marcus moved. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said, his voice carrying a tone that made several nearby aliens step back instinctively. Gone was the easygoing engineer with the dry sense of humor. This was something else entirely. Something that reminded everyone present that humans hadn't made it to the stars by being particularly nice. Vex paused, his hand inches from Mr. Whisker's fur. "Are you threatening me, human?" "I'm warning you," Marcus replied, his eyes never leaving Vex's face. "You have absolutely no idea what you're dealing with." Vex laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "It's a cat, you primitive fool. A small, helpless, domesticated creature that exists solely for your emotional gratification. Watch me demonstrate exactly how helpless it is." He lunged forward, his claws extended toward Mr. Whiskers. And that's when things got interesting. Mr. Whiskers didn't flee, didn't hiss or arch his back like a normal cat might. Instead, he simply turned his head and looked directly at Vex with an expression that could only be described as predatory. Not the instinctive aggression of a cornered animal, but the cold, calculating assessment of an apex predator sizing up its prey. For a heartbeat, the entire reception hall was silent. Then Mr. Whiskers yawned, showing teeth that seemed just a little too sharp, and began methodically cleaning his paw. Vex stumbled backward, his hand shaking. "Did you see that? Did you all see that?" "See what?" Captain Blackwood asked, her voice carefully neutral. "The way it looked at me. That wasn't normal. That was," Vex struggled for words. "That was intelligent. Malevolent. Like it was memorizing my face." Marcus smiled, but it wasn't a particularly warm expression. "Mr. Whiskers is just a cat, Vex. A small, helpless, domesticated creature, remember? Nothing to worry about." But as the crowd began to disperse, chattering nervously about the diplomatic incident, Vex caught one final glimpse of Mr. Whiskers. The cat was still sitting on the windowsill, but now he was staring directly at Vex. And in those green eyes, the reptilian diplomat saw something that made his blood run cold. Recognition. Planning. And something that looked disturbingly like anticipation. That night, as Vex lay in his quarters trying to convince himself that he'd simply imagined the whole thing, he heard it for the first time. A soft scratching sound, like claws on metal, coming from somewhere in the walls. He told himself it was just the station's environmental systems. But deep down, in the primitive part of his brain that had kept his ancestors alive on the harsh world of Zephyr Prime, he knew better. Something was coming for him. Sleep, as it turns out, is a luxury that disappears very quickly when you're convinced that something is hunting you. Vex Thornscale discovered this fundamental truth during his first night after the diplomatic reception incident, when what should have been 8 hours of restorative unconsciousness became a paranoid marathon of starting at shadows and investigating every sound. The scratching had started around 0200 hours, ship's time. Soft, deliberate, methodical. Like something with very sharp claws was exploring the ventilation system directly above his quarters. Vex had rolled out of bed, grabbed his ceremonial dagger, and spent the next 3 hours staring at the ceiling, waiting for whatever was up there to make its move. Of course, when he finally worked up the courage to call maintenance, they found nothing. Chief Petty Officer Grunt, whose species communicated primarily through grumbling and tool-wielding, had crawled through every duct and conduit in the section, reporting back with a series of mechanical grunts that roughly translated to "you're imagining things, you paranoid lizard." But the scratching, Vex insisted, his scales already beginning to show the stress patterns that indicated severe sleep deprivation. It was systematic, purposeful. Like something was mapping out my quarters. Grunt's response was a particularly eloquent grunt that needed no translation. The second night brought new horrors. Vex had barely managed to drift off when he was awakened by the sound of his personal belongings being moved around. Not violently, not destructively, but with the kind of deliberate precision that suggested intelligence. His ceremonial robes had been rearranged in his closet. His collection of Zephyrian meditation crystals had been sorted by color rather than spiritual significance. Most disturbingly, his private journal had been moved from its hiding place in his desk drawer to the center of his pillow. When he reviewed the security footage the next morning, it showed nothing. Just an empty room, his belongings mysteriously rearranging themselves while he slept. Captain Blackwood had been sympathetic but firm about the station's sensor limitations. "Sometimes the artificial gravity creates minor fluctuations," she'd explained. "That items can shift position overnight. It's perfectly normal." But Vex knew better. This wasn't gravity. This was something else entirely. Something that could move through his quarters undetected, manipulating his environment with surgical precision. The third night, his food started disappearing. Not all of it, which would have been understandable. Someone breaking into his quarters to steal his entire meal supply would have been a crime he could report, investigate, and solve. Instead, someone was taking small, precise portions. a single strip of jerky from his emergency rations, 3 berries from his imported fruit collection, half of his synthetic protein bar, leaving the wrapper perfectly resealed. "It's like something is sampling my food," he complained to Dr. Kira Voss during his mandatory wellness check, "testing it, learning my preferences." Dr. Voss, whose bedside manner could charitably be described as aggressively therapeutic, had run every medical scan in her considerable arsenal. "Your stress hormones are elevated," she'd reported, "and you're showing signs of severe sleep deprivation. But there's no evidence of cognitive impairment or hallucinatory episodes." "Because I'm not hallucinating." Vex had snapped. "Something is stalking me." "Have you considered," Dr. Voss had suggested with the kind of calm that medical professionals reserve for patients who are clearly losing their minds, that your recent conflict with Engineer Kane might be manifesting as anxiety-induced paranoia? But Vex knew it wasn't paranoia, because on the 4th night he finally saw it. He'd been lying awake, staring at the ceiling, when a shadow had moved across his peripheral vision. Not the random play of light and darkness that comes from a space station's rotation, but something deliberate. Something small and low to the ground, moving with liquid grace across his quarters. When he'd turned his head to look directly at it, there had been nothing there. But in the faint reflection of his mirror, he'd caught a glimpse of 2 green eyes watching him from the shadows beneath his desk. Eyes that glowed with an intelligence that was definitely not standard for Earth felines. The next morning he'd found paw prints on his desk. Small, precise, and completely impossible, according to the station's security protocols. How did it get in here? He'd demanded of the security chief, a stoic Volcaron whose species took pride in their logical approach to problem solving. "The quarters are sealed. The ventilation system is monitored. There's no way a cat could access this section without triggering multiple alarms." The security chief had examined the paw prints with the kind of professional skepticism that comes from years of dealing with false alarms and paranoid passengers. These appear to be naturally occurring marks in the dust pattern, he'd concluded. Possibly created by air circulation or minor vibrations. But Vex had seen the truth in those precise little impressions. Something was coming for him. Something that could move through the station's security systems like they didn't exist. Something that was taking its time, studying him, learning his routines and his weaknesses. And the worst part, every time he complained, every time he demanded additional security measures or requested a quarters transfer, he'd catch a glimpse of Marcus Kane in the corridor, watching him with that same knowing smile. "Everything all right, Vex?" Marcus would ask, his voice dripping with false concern. "You're looking a little peaked lately. Maybe you should get more sleep." By the 5th night, Vex had stopped sleeping altogether. He'd barricaded himself in his quarters, armed with every sensor and detection device he could requisition, determined to catch his tormentor in the act. That's when the real psychological warfare began. Because Mr. Whiskers, it seemed, was just getting started. There's a fine line between justifiably concerned and completely unhinged, and by the 6th day of his ordeal, Vex Thornscale had not only crossed that line but had sprinted past it, set it on fire, and was now doing victory laps around the smoldering remains of his sanity. The barricades hadn't worked. The sensors hadn't helped. The motion detectors he'd jury-rigged from spare parts had either malfunctioned or been systematically disabled, one by one throughout the night. By dawn, Vex had been reduced to huddling in the corner of his quarters, clutching a plasma torch and jumping at every shadow. "This is Security Chief Corvin to Diplomatic Quarters 7, came the voice over his comm system. "We've received multiple noise complaints from neighboring sections. Please respond." Respond. Vex had been in the middle of constructing what he'd generously termed a defensive perimeter out of furniture and ceremonial artifacts. To outside observers, it probably looked more like the fort of a particularly paranoid child, but he'd been beyond caring about appearances. "They're all in on it," he'd whispered into the comm, his voice hoarse from lack of sleep. "The human, the cat, maybe even the captain. They're coordinating a psychological attack against me. There had been a long pause. Sir, I'm going to need you to open your door so we can conduct a wellness check. Absolutely not, Vex had replied, reinforcing his barricade with his desk chair. That's exactly what they want. The moment I open that door, it'll get in. It'll finish what it started. What will get in, sir? The demon cat. Another pause, this one significantly longer. Sir, I'm reading elevated stress indicators from your quarters. Dr. Voss is on her way. That had been the beginning of what station records would later refer to as the incident. By the time Dr. Voss arrived with her team of medical technicians, Vex had completely sealed himself inside his quarters, using emergency protocols to lock down the door systems and disable the environmental controls. Vex, Dr. Voss had called through the sealed door, her voice carrying that special blend of professional concern and barely restrained exasperation that medical professionals develop when dealing with difficult patients. I need you to open this door so we can talk. Talk. Vex had laughed, a sound that even through the sealed door clearly indicated someone who had completely lost touch with reality. You want to talk? How about we talk about how a supposedly primitive Earth cat has been systematically destroying my psychological defenses for the past week? How about we discuss the fact that it can apparently phase through solid matter and disable advanced security systems? Through the door, Dr. Voss had exchanged glances with Captain Blackwood, who had arrived to assess the situation. The captain had activated her personal comm to contact Marcus Kane, who had been working in Engineering Bay 7 when the alert came through. Marcus, she'd said, we have a situation with diplomatic attaché Thornscale. He's barricaded himself in his quarters and is making some rather concerning claims about Mr. Whiskers. Marcus had arrived within minutes, still wearing his engineering coveralls and carrying a toolkit. Mr. Whiskers had been perched on his shoulder, looking for all the world like a perfectly ordinary house cat enjoying a casual stroll through the station. What kind of claims? Marcus had asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. He believes your cat is conducting psychological warfare against him, Dr. Voss had explained, her voice carefully neutral. Marcus had considered this for a moment, then reached up to scratch behind Mr. Whiskers' ears. The cat had purred contentedly, nuzzling against Marcus's hand with the kind of affection that seemed to mock the very idea of psychological warfare. That's ridiculous, Marcus had said, though anyone paying close attention might have noticed the slight twitch at the corner of his mouth. Mr. Whiskers is just a cat, a small, helpless, domesticated creature who spends most of his time sleeping and eating. From inside his quarters, Vex had apparently overheard this exchange. Lies. He'd screamed, his voice muffled by the sealed door but still clearly audible. It's been hunting me, studying me, learning my weaknesses. Sir, Captain Blackwood had called out, I'm going to need you to open this door immediately. This behavior is in violation of station safety protocols. Safety protocols? Vex had laughed again, the sound even more unhinged than before. You want to talk about safety? I've been researching Earth cats. Do you know what I found? They're not just pets. They're predators. Apex predators. On their home world, they've been responsible for the extinction of dozens of species. They hunt for sport. Not just survival. They play with their prey before killing it. Marcus had exchanged a look with Captain Blackwood. He's not wrong about that, he'd admitted. Cats are pretty effective hunters. And this one, Vex had continued, his voice rising to a near shriek, this one is different. It's been watching me, learning my routines, testing my defenses. It's like it's been specifically trained for psychological warfare. There had been a moment of silence in the corridor. Then Mr. Whiskers had yawned, showing those slightly too sharp teeth, and had begun cleaning his paw with the kind of methodical precision that suggested he had all the time in the world. Sir, Dr. Voss had said, activating her emergency medical override codes, I'm ordering you to open this door immediately. You're clearly suffering from severe sleep deprivation and acute paranoid episodes. You need medical attention. I need protection. Vex had screamed. It's going to kill me. It's been planning this from the beginning. That's when Marcus had stepped forward and pressed his hand against the sealed door. Vex, he'd said, his voice carrying a tone that made everyone in the corridor stop and listen. You want to know the truth about Mr. Whiskers? You really want to know what you're dealing with? The screaming had stopped. For a moment, the corridor had been completely silent. Open the door, Marcus had said quietly, and I'll tell you everything. The door seal disengaged with a soft hiss, revealing a sight that would have been comedic if it weren't so genuinely pathetic. Vex Thornscale, once the picture of diplomatic composure, stood in the center of his destroyed quarters wearing nothing but his undergarments and a layer of paranoid sweat. His ceremonial furniture had been arranged into what could generously be called a fortress, complete with sight lines and escape routes that would have impressed a military strategist. Well, Marcus said, stepping into the chaos while Mr. Whiskers rode serenely on his shoulder, this is certainly thorough. Vex's eyes were locked on the cat, his pupils dilated with sleep deprivation and terror. Keep it away from me, he whispered, backing against the far wall. Please. I can't take any more. Dr. Voss moved to follow, but Marcus held up a hand. Give us a minute, Doc. I think it's time Vex and I had a proper conversation. Captain Blackwood nodded to her medical team, and they retreated to the corridor, leaving Marcus, Mr. Whiskers, and the thoroughly broken Vex alone in the devastated quarters. You want to know what Mr. Whiskers really is? Marcus asked, settling cross-legged on the floor. The cat hopped down from his shoulder and began exploring the makeshift fortress with obvious interest. You want to know why he's been playing with you like a toy mouse? Vex nodded frantically, his eyes never leaving the cat. He's exactly what I said he was, Marcus continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone explaining something to a particularly slow child. A cat. A small, domesticated earth feline with a fondness for tuna and afternoon naps. But the scratching, Vex protested weakly. The way he moves, the intelligence in his eyes. Oh, that, Marcus waved dismissively. Yeah, Mr. Whiskers is definitely smarter than your average house cat. See, here's the thing you never bothered to research in all your scientific analysis of primitive human bonding rituals. Cats aren't our pets, Vex. They're our partners. Mr. Whiskers had found a particularly interesting piece of debris from Vex's furniture fort and was batting at it with obvious enjoyment. But there was something almost deliberate about the way he was positioning himself, always keeping Vex in his peripheral vision. Partners? Vex's voice cracked. Thousands of years ago. Marcus explained, clearly enjoying himself now. Cats chose to live with humans. Not because we domesticated them, but because they recognized a mutually beneficial relationship. We provided food and shelter. They provided pest control and companionship. But more than that, they provided something else. Something that proved invaluable when we started exploring the galaxy. Marcus reached into his toolkit and pulled out what looked like a standard tablet, but when he activated it, the display showed readings that made Vex's eyes widen in recognition. Stress hormones, Marcus said, pointing to the various spikes and dips on the screen. Psychological pressure indicators. Behavioral pattern analysis. Mr. Whiskers has been conducting a comprehensive psychological profile of you for the past week. Every time you threatened him, every time you called him primitive or useless, he was learning, studying, planning. But how? Vex whispered. He's just an animal. Just an animal? Marcus laughed. Vex, cats are apex predators. They've been refined by millions of years of evolution to be perfect hunters. They can move silently through any environment, study their prey for extended periods, and strike with precision when the time is right. Did you really think we'd travel to the stars without bringing our best assets? Mr. Whiskers looked up from his exploration and fixed Vex with that same predatory stare that had started this whole mess. But now, instead of seeming like simple animal instinct, it looked like the calculated assessment of a skilled professional. The enhanced feline program. Marcus continued, apparently deciding that full disclosure was the only way to end this situation, was one of humanity's first successful attempts at symbiotic intelligence enhancement. We didn't make cats smarter. We just gave them the tools to express the intelligence they already had. Mr. Whiskers isn't just my pet, but he's my partner, my colleague, my early warning system for psychological threats. Vex's legs gave out, and he slumped against the wall. You're saying he's been interrogating me? Not interrogating, Marcus corrected. Analyzing. See, when you started your little campaign against him, Mr. Whiskers took it as a challenge. You called him primitive, so he decided to demonstrate just how advanced he really was. Everything that happened to you this week, every move, every sound, every psychological pressure point he exploited, it was all carefully calculated to achieve a specific result. What result? Marcus smiled, but it wasn't entirely friendly. To make you understand that underestimating humanity's primitive companions is a mistake you'll never make again. Mr. Whiskers yawned, showing those sharp teeth, and began cleaning his paw with the kind of methodical precision that suddenly seemed a lot more ominous. The scratching in the walls, Marcus explained, was him mapping your quarters through the ventilation system. The moved objects were psychological pressure tactics designed to make you feel vulnerable in your own space. The food sampling was him learning your dietary preferences and chemical responses, and the apparent ability to phase through. Solid matter? Cats are liquid, Vex. They can fit through any opening larger than their skull. Vex looked at Mr. Whiskers, who was now sitting primly with his tail wrapped around his paws, looking for all the world like a perfectly ordinary house cat. Except for the eyes. Those green eyes that held an intelligence that was definitely not ordinary. So when you threatened him, Marcus continued, you weren't just insulting my pet. You were challenging a highly trained intelligence operative who happens to have 4 legs and a purr. I didn't know, Vex whispered. Of course you didn't, Marcus replied, standing up and offering his hand to help Vex to his feet. Because you assumed that anything different from your own culture must be primitive. You never considered that maybe, just maybe, humans and cats figured out something about cooperation that your species missed. Vex took the offered hand, his legs still shaky from exhaustion and shock. What happens now? Now, Marcus said, you're going to get some sleep. Dr. Voss is going to make sure you're medically cleared. And then you're going to go back to your diplomatic duties with a new understanding of what it means to be part of a truly diverse galactic community. Mr. Whiskers meowed once, a sound that somehow managed to convey both forgiveness and warning. And Vex, Marcus added as they walked toward the door. Next time you meet a human's primitive companion, you might want to remember that evolution doesn't always look the way you expect it to. As they reached the corridor, where Dr. Voss and her team were waiting, Vex turned back for one last look at his destroyed quarters. Then he looked down at Mr. Whiskers, who was once again perched on Marcus's shoulder. I'm sorry, he said quietly. I underestimated you both. Mr. Whiskers purred, a sound that somehow managed to convey gracious acceptance of the apology. But those green eyes remained alert, watchful, and completely unforgiving of anyone who might make the same mistake twice. 3 months later, Vex Thornscale had become something of a station legend. Not for his diplomatic achievements, though those had improved considerably, but for his newfound role as an unofficial educator about the dangers of underestimating Earth's primitive species. His presentation on advanced symbiotic intelligence systems in human culture had become required viewing for all new arrivals to Harmony 7. The key point to remember. Vex would tell his audiences, his scales now maintaining a healthy color that indicated proper sleep and significantly reduced stress levels. is that evolution doesn't always manifest in the ways we expect. Sometimes the most advanced civilizations are the ones that learn to work with other species rather than dominating them. Marcus, watching from the back of the conference room during one of these presentations, couldn't help but smile. Mr. Whiskers, curled up in his usual spot on Marcus's lap, opened one green eye and looked at Vex with what might have been approval. "Any questions?" Vex asked his audience of newly arrived diplomats and crew members. A young Altarian raised a tentacle. "What about other Earth animals? Are they all enhanced like cats?" Vex glanced at Marcus, who nodded encouragingly. "That," Vex said with the kind of smile that suggested he'd learned to appreciate the universe's sense of humor, "is an excellent question. Engineer Kane, would you like to field that one?" Marcus stood up, still holding Mr. Whiskers, and walked to the front of the room. "Well," he said, his voice carrying that same casual tone that had once driven Vex to distraction, "let me tell you about dogs, and dolphins, and the truly terrifying intelligence of Earth's corvids." The audience leaned forward eagerly, and in the back of the room, Captain Blackwood made a note to increase the xenobiology training budget. Again. Mr. Whiskers purred contentedly, his mission accomplished. After all, respect was something that had to be earned, one psychological warfare campaign at a time.